So let's talk through some Hellscapes battlefields, tree campaigns, and Unbound demons running wild, with an overview of what's in the new Armageddon book. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a roundup of what's in this book and examining the rules content of the Crusade Armageddon book that Games Workshop's brought out this weekend. It's certainly been a busy week for Warhammer 40K. Games Workshop's had the Space Wolf army set and that new chapter approved mission deck going live, though alongside those has also been the next chapter in Armageddon's Great Wars, with this Crusade Armageddon book actually being a surprisingly popular release, at least by the polling that I did. It looks like equal amounts of people wanted to pick up this as did the Space Wolf army set, at least according to you guys. The book itself is similar to the previous Crusade books. We've had ones for Leviathan, Pariah Nexus, the Nakwan Gauntlet, and now Armageddon for 10th edition 40k. And as with the rest of those, it's sort of a split offering, half a book worth of lore, maps, pictures of the characters involved, and some expansions to the current setting of Warhammer 40k. Hopefully in the next week or two I'll aim to do a full breakdown of the lore section there. It'll be interesting to take a look at any major developments with the latest war for Armageddon. I guess this one's the 4th war, and Angron's second invasion of it, the main narrative being that he's creating a great big warp grate out in the Fire Wastes, and then a combined task force of Grey Knight, Space Wolves and Black Templars stands against him, trying to safeguard this vital linchpin world for the Imperium and turn back the tide of demons. Aside from the lore and narrative section though, there's a whole bunch of Crusade rules, many of which seemed pretty interesting, and split into a whole bunch of sections, which you certainly could use all put together in the great big tree campaign that they've got going. Lots of the sections play into each other in various different ways, or you could maybe use one or more of them for other games if you wanted to shake things up for some different play for casual games. As mentioned, I'll be focusing on rules for this one, though hopefully I'll aim to swing back for the lore at a later date. In any case, here's a rough breakdown of the content of the book. They reprint the generic Crusade rules here, basic things for mustering an army, Crusade cards and requisitions and how they all work. Seems to be fairly standard stuff there. Then the mainstay of the book is the Armageddon tree campaign. Different branching paths with some slight variations depending on the attacker and defender, but ultimately all leading up to one big mission at the end. There's plenty of the slightly more generic standard Crusade extra content, things like new relics, battle traits, and agendas and things like that, generally themes to the whole idea of fighting in a warp-infused battlefield. There's also some Mighty Champions rules that give you some enhanced Crusade rules for various epic heroes out there. Then there's sort of 3 bonus rule sets that all interlink together a little bit. Hellscapes of rules for fighting in warp-touch battlefields with some really funky things going on, with various wild things like units teleporting around the board or stopping shooting to certain parts. Warp Anomalies, where you basically have a warp storm table and you roll for the effect each turn. Some units might get buffed or nerfed by that. And then Unbound Adversaries, and these are rules for sort of unbound demons running around and just killing everything, whether they serve the forces of the Imperium, Chaos, or anyone else, just hostile mobs that might turn up for a variety of reasons to attack people. And then they all get tied together by the Crusade missions in the book, many of them themes to represent various different fights at the different stages of the tree campaign, and they make use of those major themed rule sets. Starting out, the core idea of the book is the Armageddon tree campaign, and this one looks like one of the central ideas of the book. Most of the Crusade books have an idea to do something slightly differently. The idea behind this one is that you'll have 3 different alliances: Gatebreakers to repel the forces of Chaos, which are generally Imperial themed, so named because of their desire to try and destroy Angron's great warp gate on the planet. Desecrators to represent the forces of Chaos and all their activities, and then Marauders, various other forces out for themselves in some way. I guess they'd be the ones to represent Xenos ideally. The idea behind this is that you have an overall campaign master. At the start of the campaign you gather a whole bunch of players along who want to play. That seems like it would also work fine for just a pair of players playing with the Imperium and Chaos, for example. And then the campaign is divided into 4 phases. These phases sort of represent the initial conflicts, then the sides trying to press home their objectives, or trying to get themselves out of a desperate situation, and ultimately either way leading up to a big fight for the warp gate, where you might get a few advantages if you've done well in the earlier phase. You can either play through these phases in a faster or a slower way. They say that very fast is either 1 game per player per phase, so you could have just 2 people play through the entire campaign in as little as 1 game per phase there. In theory, you could even get that all done in a day if you're fairly rapid, or you could have a great big grinding conflict where each player plays 4 games. Maybe you could say each phase was a month or something if you wanted a campaign to last a third of the year. Might depend on your group size, the engagement of the players, and how regularly you meet. Overall, at the end of each phase, you add up a bunch of victory points called strategic points here, and the alliance out of the 3 allegiances is the one that succeeds its narrative goal for that phase, and the rest all lose. Basically, each of those allegiances has a tree campaign that looks a bit like this. This is the example one for the Gatebreakers, so I guess the forces of the Imperium, but the other 2 look pretty similar to it. They just have some slight tweaks on the goals that they're trying to achieve and slightly different objectives they're trying to do. At the start of the Imperial campaign, their goals are to stabilise the front, and for that one they're just literally trying to win games for 5 strategy points each. If they're the alliance that comes out on top, they gain a plus 50 points requisition bonus when they're increasing their supply limit. So if they're defeated, they still get a bonus. The first time that their army fails battle shock, they count the test as passed instead. So it's not necessarily like you get super punished for your allegiance not having won too much in the last round. In general though, broadly between the benefits, it feels like you get a bit more for your allegiance having come out on top. For example, the Chaos going into the last round might have the chance for -1 to wound for all of their units with warp tokens, and that could be really quite a big impactful defensive buff for the last fight. Other ones for the Imperium though are reclaiming lost hives to get units into the enemy deployment zone, raising enemy monoliths to try and control the marker in your opponent's drop zone by the end of the game. And then ultimately everything goes to Shatter the Red Angel's Gate, where I guess you play the final mission in the book, and in that one your side gains a small advantage if they've won previous phases. You gain command points for each previous campaign phase that you've won. So say if one allegiance had won all the previous 3, they'd be +3 command points into that mission. And then ultimately the side that wins the most of those battles in the last phase is probably the one that wins the campaign. Overall feels like a fairly fun system. Doesn't seem to have too much of a snowball effect with one army winning so they win harder later. I feel like getting increasing small buffs towards the last mission. It's quite a cool idea to have the whole thing with a sense of building to something. Before we move on to some Unbound Demons and Hellscape battlefields though, I'll just give a quick shout out to Warhaus, the sponsor of today's video. They're a recently opened gaming store in Brisbane, Australia, with their grand opening in April 2025, and have some of the biggest discounts versus Games Workshop worldwide, 23% off Games Workshop's prices, so a pretty great place to order in some models if you live down under. Here's their web store, which will be linked down in the video description. It's generally pretty easy to navigate and search things when I've been trying. They generally tend to aim to have good numbers of pre-orders, and have quite a good stock for the Games Workshop range in general. You can back order things if they're not in stock as per normal with discount retailers. They've got a Warpoint system as well, which can give you some further discounts for returning customers. As mentioned, their store is now open as of April 2025. It's based in Corinda outside Brisbane, and they've got 2 full-size gaming tables if you want to check them out for public use. For this week's pre-orders, they have the Crusade Armageddon book, if you did want to pick that up down under, and they also seem to have some copies of the Space Wolves Army Set box set that's being sold at 23% off if you were looking for that one. In any case, check them out, links down in the video description if you live in Australia, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Let's get into some other warp shenanigans though, and first up we have those Hellscapes. These are basically battlefield rules to represent fighting in a warp-touched environment. I feel like in general they've been pretty bold and fairly wacky with these rules. Environmental effects that might have units isolated from each other, generate warp tokens, teleport around the battlefield, or in combination with the mission summon in some Unbound Adversaries. There's 8 of these in total, and 2 missions per Hellscape. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just for a couple of examples, the first couple are Fractured Realm. We have an expanding area of rifts around each objective marker that get bigger as the battle goes on, 3 inches around them to start with, then going to 6 and 9 inches in later battle rounds. Units wholly within these rift areas can only target units that are either within the rift area as well, or in engagement range of them. And units outside the rifts can't target those unless they're also within. I guess it means that you might be able to shoot from one objective marker to another, but units outside the rifts might not be able to interact with the things on the objective markers, so I guess gives you loads of incentive to fight for those objectives and get stuck in at close range. Then there's one called Folded Space, which allows you to do an action on your home objective deployment zone marker, and then your unit gets to do a 3-inch deep strike teleport into the enemy deployment zone somewhere. So you could have some wild shooting units using a Folded Space trickery to get them in and shoot hard against the enemy deployment zone, which definitely is kind of mad with certain shooting units. I think definitely the emphasis here is on fun and random stuff happening and seeing how both players deal with it, as opposed to being anything too balanced or anything like that. It's going to be pretty impossible to balance giving just all of Warhammer 40K's units 3-inch deep strike if they want it, which in general is a pretty big and powerful ability. Then on top of that there's a sort of warp storm effect called Anomalies. These again are determined by the mission rules, and they spell out just how wild and random these will be. Different battles will have different levels of them. They can be anything from local to planet-wide and minor versus catastrophic, and in practice that means that you could be rolling at the start of literally every player turn, or just at the start of certain battle rounds. In any case, you roll a 3d6 on a table. They've triggered certain mission rules as well on an 11 or 10, but otherwise here are a few more examples. If you roll a 4 on those 3d6, then both players get to select an enemy unit with a warp counter and deal d6 mortal wounds to them. Generally missions or these anomalies can hand out warp counters. One can debuff warp counter units for -1 toughness, the 10 one can hand out some warp counters, and maybe activate the mission rule as well, and a 15 can allow you to choose a unit with a warp counter to gain lethal hits. It basically means that units with warp counters could be pretty random by this table, either getting buffs or debuffs. Then finally, for the main very different rule sections, there's a whole one for Unbound Adversaries, and as mentioned, these are demonic entities hostile to both players' armies. These typically get spawned in some way by the mission rules, sometimes having more and more of them spawn as the battle goes on. The idea of these are that they're random corn demons appearing and just destroying everything. They could be adapted for other models and things. They have rules for a greater demon, a sort of beast-like hound type thing, a spawn sort of creature, and a lesser demon one, though their melee isn't quite as punchy as bloodletters. When they're generated with a certain power level between 1 and 3, and then you randomise between 2 options. For example, power level 1 is either spawning in 10 lesser demons or 2 abominations, which are the spawn style ones, and there's 4 generic datasheets in the book for them. It gives you a hint as to what sort of size models to use for them, but in general you could use anything from your collection or just proxy with something else if you didn't have something suitable. When you have random ones spawn in, the player with the highest number of warp counters gets to choose where they're set up. And that could be a fairly big deal, as you probably put them towards the enemy army, and then they basically have their own turn after the 2 player turns, where they'll move towards the closest unit, shoot the closest unit if they've got a shooting attack, charge the closest unit, and then they have their own fight phase where only they activate, and they can't activate in any other player's fight phase. Basically they're 40k automatic enemies, just there to get in the way and cause problems, and they'll continue to do so on autopilot mode. Then to tie those all together, there's 2 missions per Hellscape. If you want to randomly generate them, then you can roll for them on some 3d3 tables, though I feel like for this campaign it might just make sense to pick the mission that seems to be most closely suited to what the armies are trying to achieve at the time. For just one of the basic sort of get you going style missions, there's one called Total Domination with a sort of hammer and anvil style deployments, as you can see here. This one uses the folded space Hellscape, so warping units into the enemy's deployment zone when you want to. They have major widespread warp anomalies, so they happen at the start of the battle round, and then at the start of the game you have a power level 2 Unbound Adversaries unit setting up in the centre of the board, so they could potentially be a problem for the first player to advance into the mid-board. For this one you score victory points for controlling No Man's Land's objectives, and then more victory points for the enemy home field objective, as well as any Crusade related agendas that you're trying to achieve, or the goals from the current phase. As mentioned, there's a whole ton of different missions, plenty of which have some pretty crazy rules, various flavours of spawning demons and things like that. The last one's called Assault the Warp Gate, where there's a small defender deployment zone and quite a lot of spawning in of unbound adversaries, where the defender needs to hold out against all costs, presumably while they hold out and try and do a ritual to close Angron's great big gate. Aside from that, there's a whole bunch of slightly more normal Crusade rule sections, many of which are pretty familiar and just have had various different versions in the previous Crusade supplements. One that's maybe a little bit different are the Mighty Champions ones that allow you to enhance epic heroes with a Crusade ability. And in theory, the idea of this one is they're handed out by the campaign maker to give an appropriate trait for epic heroes when they're added to a player's order of battle. There's a whole bunch of different ones. For 2 examples, there's a Nemesis Champion one, where whenever a character model slays an enemy character, they gain your entire army an extra experience point, and if they kill the Warlord, they gain a strategic point, which could be helpful towards the end of round goals. And then there's one called an Inspirational Champion. While he's leading a unit, you ignore any battle scars that the unit has, and you can select an additional unit to be marked for greatness at the end of the game. There's a bunch more of them, and they have some historical suggestions, such as saying Angron could be a Nemesis Champion, and Grimaldus could be an Inspirational Champion, so maybe nice to give some epic heroes a bit more Crusade flavour. Then they've got some of the normal battle traits and blessings. Battle traits for infantry, monsters and vehicles, mounted units, beasts and psyche units. Most of them are generally themed around warp shenanigans of one sort or another. Some are fairly standard, such as giving plus 1 inch movement to infantry, or monsters and vehicles being warded in some way to give them some mortal wound and psychic defense, and some give damage buffs against unbound adversaries that you might come across. The blessings also have some standard and themed ones. Grand Strategist, for example, allows your army to start with 2 command points. These are the sort of more character-focused ones, and they have one themed one for each of the various different allegiances. The Chaos-themed one is to cause an unbound adversaries unit to treat your army as friendly once per game. So in the theory, you might have some of those Spawn or Hounds models or something. Just ignore your unit and go after an enemy one, which feels like it could be pretty helpful if they're around in a mission. They've also got the agendas and things like the Crusade relics. For a couple of examples of Crusade relics, there's a Grimoire Abjuratus that gives the unit a -1 to wound versus beast and mounted models, and also a -1 to hit for unbound adversaries, and a fun legendary one called the Vengeance Totem. When the bearer's unit gets destroyed, all the enemy units within 6 inches take D3 mortal wounds on a 4+, and if the bearer's unit had any warp counters, an Unbound Adversaries unit appears in their place, with a power level equal to the amount of counters that they had. Could mean that a whole bunch of spawn or even a bloodthirster or something bursts out of them. Overall, at first impressions, it feels interesting enough for those enjoyers of Crusade out there. A self-contained little system, and I feel like it's quite nice that the tree campaign could in theory be either done over, say, just a couple of game sessions, with each player playing one battle per mission, or stretched out to a long period and accommodate really quite a lot of players if that's what you're looking for. The game modes definitely have a focus on more wild fun things happening. The mission rules and the Unbound Adversary things feel quite nice. Feels like the Warp Storm type thing. Might just add a bunch of randomness and maybe some slightly annoying penalties that aren't always super well received in 40k when you just get random buffs or debuffs from the sky. It does feel like you'd have quite a bit to track and keep going on with things like those warp token counters for certain units, what the warp anomaly effect is, as well as any other things like the Crusade agendas and stuff. Does seem pretty fun for a casual self-contained campaign though. I'll be interested to hear if you guys are tempted to pick it up or leave it on the shelf. Is anyone thinking of giving this a go with their playgroup? As mentioned, a big thank you to Warhaus for sponsoring the video. You can check them out, links down in the video description if you want to pick this up in Australia. And of course, for the rest of you around the world, there's all the other channel affiliate discount links down in the video description as well. A big thank you to anyone using those. They help to support Auspex Tactics videos. I'll leave this there for now though. If you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying and you'd like to support the videos on the channel, then check out the Patreon page. That's linked down in the video description. There's a few benefits on that, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways. Check that out if you'd like, though in any case a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.